A landlocked nation stood where empires once demanded obedience. In Ouagadougou, a soldier-turned-president looked at a tariff threat from Washington and simply said no. It was a moment so small on paper, yet so vast in meaning, a refusal that cracked the myth of Western inevitability. For decades, Africa has been told its path is dependency, that markets must be begged for, that dignity must be mortgaged for access. Tariffs, sanctions, conditional aid, always the same weapons dressed in new language. But in 2025, the script broke. Donald Trump sought to tighten America's grip with sweeping tariffs on African gold, cocoa, cotton, textiles, and food. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest leader on the continent, broke the grip itself. This was not charity. This was not compromise. This was sovereignty spoken aloud. And it leaves us with one burning question. Was this a trade dispute or the spark of an African dawn? Stay with us. What follows is more than a headline. It is history unfolding. Subscribe and walk with us into this story. Tariffs are often disguised as numbers, percentages printed on customs papers, percentages slipped into trade agreements. Yet behind every tariff lies a weapon. It is a chain that binds exporters, a chokehold on fragile economies, a whip disguised as policy. For Washington, this was the chosen tool once more. Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on African exports, targeting gold, cocoa, cotton, textiles, and food staples. These were not trivial products. They were the veins through which economies breathe, the backbone of rural livelihoods, the fragile link between small farmers and the world beyond. The calculation was simple, at least in Washington's eyes. Africa, fragmented and dependent, would have no choice but to kneel. Leaders would rush to the table, hats in hand, pleading for exemptions and carve-outs. The same ritual played out for decades. America would dictate terms. Africa would comply. But this time the script shattered. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré spoke words that carried more force than the tariffs themselves. He announced that Burkina Faso would not accept tariff blackmail, that dignity was not a commodity to be negotiated. In that instant, a landlocked nation of barely 22 million declared a trade war of principles. The shockwaves were immediate. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou, their cheers less like applause and more like release, a catharsis after generations of leaders bowing under Western pressure. The chant was not about numbers, but about sovereignty. In Washington, however, the mood was fury bordering on disbelief. For Donald Trump, a man who thrived on the optics of dominance, being defied by one of Africa's smallest states was more than inconvenient. It was humiliation. Reports suggest his advisors scrambled late into the night, weighing retaliation. Would sanctions follow? Would diplomatic isolation be imposed? Or would America attempt to coerce Burkina Faso quietly away from headlines? None of those options erased the fact that the script had already changed. An African state had not begged. It had not bargained. It had simply refused. The tariffs themselves had been designed as a hammer, descending heavily on economies seen as brittle. Gold exports would be throttled. Cocoa and cotton, the lifeblood of millions of farmers, would be forced into warehouses unsold. Textiles meant for American stores would be stranded at ports. And yet, when faced with this hammer, Traoré did not bend. He flipped the table. He reframed the tariffs not as an economic strategy, but as desperation. Proof that America was running out of subtler tools. In doing so, he did something remarkable. He turned humiliation back on the sender. Washington expected panic. What it got instead was defiance wrapped in clarity. Symbolism here mattered more than spreadsheets. In geopolitics, perception often outweighs raw numbers. If a so-called small player could stand against America and remain standing, then what excuse would larger African nations have? This question began to echo beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Was this the first crack in the architecture of Western leverage over Africa? The stakes, then, were larger than tariffs. They were about dignity and precedent. For centuries, Africa was cast as an object, a source of raw materials, a market for foreign goods, a stage for foreign influence. Now, in a single act, one nation had inverted the script. Burkina Faso did not beg for access. It declared that access itself was negotiable and that sovereignty was not for sale. The immediate aftermath showed two realities clashing. On one side, Washington clinging to a 20th century playbook of pressure. On the other, a young African leader declaring that the era of passive obedience was over. Which of these realities would prevail was not yet clear. But what was undeniable was this: history would no longer be written in only one capital. And so the question lingers. If a soldier president from Ouagadougou can defy the White House, What happens when others begin to follow? Every confrontation has its breaking point, and in this story, it came with breathtaking speed. Within hours of Ibrahim Traoré's refusal, Washington's fury began to circulate through diplomatic cables. Officials described the mood as disbelief, even insult. For decades, the assumption had been that African leaders, faced with economic pain, would retreat into submission. Yet this time, the retreat never came. Instead, the defiance spread like fire. In Ouagadougou, celebrations spilled into the streets. People gathered in markets, neighborhoods, and squares, repeating the words their president had spoken. "We will not kneel." The atmosphere was not simply political. It was emotional release, as if an entire generation had been waiting to exhale after years of compliance. Burkina Faso, often dismissed in Western narratives as marginal, suddenly became the stage of continental catharsis. In Washington, by contrast, the refusal was described as humiliation. For Donald Trump, who had wielded tariffs as instruments of dominance against China, Mexico, and Europe, being defied by a small, landlocked state was more than unexpected. It was intolerable. His advisors scrambled. Some pushed for escalating sanctions. Others proposed freezing aid and diplomatic isolation. Yet behind every option lay the same uncomfortable reality. The old methods no longer guaranteed compliance. The moment of rupture came just 72 hours later. Traoré did not wait to see how Washington might respond. He moved first. Reports confirmed that within 3 days, a coalition of 34 African nations had been mobilized, aligning behind emergency trade frameworks. Alternative routes were activated. Gold earmarked for America was redirected to Moscow. Cocoa and agricultural produce were absorbed by Asian markets. Infrastructure-linked agreements with China expanded overnight, while India and Brazil widened their doors to African exports. It was as if the continent had rehearsed for this moment, quietly preparing for the day when Western pressure would tighten again. When the test finally came, Africa did not scatter. It closed ranks. For the first time in living memory, an economic hammer aimed at Africa met not panic, but coordination. The symbolism was staggering. Burkina Faso, not Nigeria with its oil, not South Africa with its industry, not Egypt with its geostrategic weight, had triggered a continental shield. A so-called small player had disrupted the entire logic of Western leverage. Suddenly, the image of Africa was not one of fragmentation, but of unity forged under pressure. Reactions across the globe were swift. In Beijing, announcements of expanded purchasing agreements and currency swaps arrived within days. Moscow declared readiness to refine and purchase African gold directly, bypassing Western financial systems. New Delhi quietly expanded its import quotas for food staples, providing markets for African maize, pulses, and dairy. Even Brasilia, often overlooked, stepped in to strengthen agricultural exchanges. Europe hesitated, caught between loyalty to Washington and the risk of losing access to African markets altogether. While Brussels stopped short of fully defying American policy, it also declined to follow Trump into tariff warfare. In doing so, Europe inadvertently widened the cracks in Western unity. The effect on public opinion in Africa was electric. Newspapers in Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya carried headlines framing Traoré not as an outlier, but as a symbol. Radio broadcasts replayed his words, and social media amplified his image as the young leader who had done what so many before him had not. The narrative was no longer about tariffs. It was about dignity. Traoré's act was interpreted not as an isolated policy choice, but as the opening of a new chapter, one in which African leaders could refuse without collapse, defy without destruction. The message spread beyond borders, resonating in Latin America and parts of Asia. If Burkina Faso could withstand pressure, why not others? For Washington, this was the true danger. The fear that once underpinned its influence, the fear of sanctions, the fear of isolation, the fear of economic collapse, was suddenly punctured. Once fear collapses, compliance collapses with it. And without compliance, leverage evaporates. This was the high point of the confrontation, the moment when a single rejection transformed into a continental echo, amplified by alliances beyond Africa. What began as a tariff dispute had morphed into a direct challenge to the architecture of Western control. And yet a question lingered at the edges of this triumph. Who exactly was the man at the center of it all? Who was Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier who dared to face Washington, the leader who galvanized a continent, the figure now whispered about in Western corridors of power with unease? Every act of defiance carries consequences, and in the wake of Ibrahim Traoré's rejection, the ripples spread across both the domestic and continental stage. The first and most immediate concern was whether Burkina Faso could withstand the economic squeeze. Washington hinted at sanctions, muttered about aid freezes, and whispered threats of diplomatic isolation. Yet on the ground in Ouagadougou, the mood was not fear. It was resolve. Short-term consequences were visible in rising uncertainty for exporters who had once relied on the American market. Farmers wondered if their cocoa and cotton would find buyers. Miners questioned whether gold could bypass Western refiners. Yet these anxieties were quickly answered as alternative markets opened. Russia's refiners stepped in, offering direct contracts. China's industrial demand absorbed shipments of raw materials. India's food markets expanded imports, and Brazil's agricultural giants began to collaborate on crop exchanges. The surprise was not only that trade continued, but that it did so with remarkable speed. For ordinary Burkinabe, the signal was clear. Their leader's gamble had not doomed them. Instead, it seemed to open a doorway to resilience. The fear of collapse, long cultivated by Western threats, did not materialize. Politically, the consequences were even more profound. Traoré's stance resonated as a rupture in Africa's long history of dependency. For decades, governments across the continent had oscillated between foreign aid and foreign pressure, often trapped in cycles that enriched external partners while leaving local populations impoverished. Traoré's refusal was seen as a break in that cycle. It was not simply policy. It was precedent. At home, his legitimacy surged. Already popular as a soldier president who had risen from the ranks rather than from elite schools, his defiance gave him a mantle far greater than office. He became the embodiment of pride, of dignity reclaimed. For a people accustomed to leaders who bowed before Western ultimatums, his words carried the force of liberation. The cheers in Ouagadougou were not just about tariffs. They were about a restoration of self-respect. Regionally, the acts shifted political currents. Other leaders, once cautious, now faced pressure from their own populations to emulate Burkina Faso's stance. If a small, landlocked state could resist, why not Nigeria with its oil wealth? Why not South Africa with its industry? Why not Egypt with its geostrategic power? The question, once unthinkable, became unavoidable. In the medium term, this meant potential political realignment. Countries long tethered to Western contracts began to explore alternatives with greater boldness. The African Continental Free Trade Area, once an ambitious project, suddenly felt urgent and practical. Intra-African trade gained momentum, and regional blocs began to discuss shielding themselves collectively from external economic shocks. What had begun as a tariff dispute now risked becoming a catalyst for continental integration. For Washington, the nightmare scenario was unfolding. Not only resistance in Burkina Faso, but replication across Africa. Influence based on fear was eroding. And with each erosion, America's leverage weakened. The idea that Africa could not survive without Western approval was collapsing in real time. At the heart of this transformation stood Traoré's past. His rise to power in 2022, often described as the Ibrahim Traoré coup, had already marked a break with tradition. He was not the product of foreign grooming, not beholden to former colonial patrons. His coup was controversial abroad, yet domestically it was embraced as a reset, a chance to reclaim sovereignty from decades of dependency. His rejection of Trump's tariffs was seen as a natural extension of that principle. Yet challenges remain. Questions about sustainability loomed. Could alternative markets absorb Africa's exports indefinitely? Would multipolar partnerships offer fairer terms or simply replicate dependency in another form? These uncertainties hovered like shadows at the edge of triumph. Still, for millions of Africans, the symbolism outweighed the risks. For the first time in living memory, a leader had shown that survival without Western consent was possible. The effect was intoxicating. Hope mingled with pride, and pride mingled with expectation. If this defiance could be sustained, perhaps it was more than a moment. Perhaps it was the beginning of a movement. But movements are fragile, and the world was watching closely. Would international partners continue to shield Burkina Faso? Would neighboring states follow the example? Or would pressure from Washington intensify until the cracks appeared? The answer for now remained uncertain. Yet one fact could not be denied. The architecture of dependency had been punctured. And once punctured, it could never be restored to its former shape. The question now moved beyond one country or one leader. It became continental. Could Africa, long treated as a pawn, seize this moment to become a player? The confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump did not unfold in isolation. It was a collision that reverberated across capitals, reshaping calculations in Beijing, Moscow, New Delhi, Brasilia, and Brussels. For each of these powers, the rejection of American tariffs was more than an African dispute. It was a signal that the balance of global commerce was shifting. China moved first. Its industrial machine depends heavily on African resources. Cobalt from the Congo, manganese from South Africa, bauxite from Guinea. Any attempt to choke African exports threatened Beijing's lifelines. Within days of Washington's announcement, China expanded purchasing agreements, offered new currency swaps, and pledged to stabilize African trade flows. To Beijing, supporting Burkina Faso was not charity. It was necessity. Russia followed with equal speed. For Moscow, gold was the bridge. Burkina Faso had already emerged as a strategic supplier, and Russian refiners were eager to bypass Western systems. Offers of security partnerships were coupled with direct commodity exchanges. Russia did not only buy African gold, it guaranteed that African exports would not be left stranded. India's role was quieter, but no less critical. With a population exceeding 1.4 billion and rising food demand, India became a ready market for African maize, pulses, and dairy. More importantly, it provided Africa with affordable pharmaceuticals, creating a loop of mutual dependence. When U.S. tariffs attempted to strangle African agricultural exports, India opened its markets wider. Brazil stepped in with cultural as well as economic ties. Its agricultural sector saw Africa not just as a competitor, but as a partner. In the wake of Trump's tariffs, Brasilia strengthened bilateral trade channels, giving African cash crops and staples a new destination. It was South-South solidarity turned into pragmatic economics. Even Europe hesitated to follow Washington's lead. The European Union, already struggling with energy insecurity and wary of losing ground to Beijing and Moscow, quietly absorbed some redirected African exports. Though Brussels did not echo Traoré's anti-Western rhetoric, its reluctance to join Trump's tariff war widened the cracks in Western unity. This convergence of partners gave Africa something unprecedented, a shield. Not a shield built on aid or dependency, but on multipolar necessity. The message was clear. America could attempt isolation, but in a world of many suitors, isolation was no longer guaranteed. It is this convergence that transforms Burkina Faso's stance into more than national defiance. It becomes a continental revolution. The Burkina Faso revolution is not defined by one leader alone, but by the reality that Africa now stands in a world where alternatives exist, where sovereignty is no longer a fantasy, but a negotiable position backed by alliances. And yet the question lingers like a drumbeat. If multipolarity has created a shield for Africa today, what possibilities does that shield unlock for tomorrow? The dust of confrontation rarely settles quickly. As the world absorbed Ibrahim Traoré's rejection of Donald Trump's tariffs, attention turned to the future. What would come next for Burkina Faso, for Africa, and for the architecture of global trade? The risks were obvious. Washington still possessed formidable tools. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, financial restrictions. Each could be deployed to test Burkina Faso's resilience. Yet the events of 2025 revealed that those tools no longer carried the same inevitability. Multipolarity had diluted their force. Where once Africa faced the West alone, it now stood with alternatives. For Burkina Faso, the path ahead was both promising and perilous. Traoré had elevated his nation to symbolic heights, but symbolism does not substitute for policy. The challenge would be to turn dignity into development, to ensure that the defiance of tariffs translated into tangible improvements in agriculture, mining, and public services. Sovereignty, after all, is not merely the absence of dependency. It is the presence of capacity. Across Africa, the ripple effects were undeniable. The spectacle of a small, landlocked country standing firm forced larger nations to reconsider their own calculations. Nigeria with its oil, South Africa with its industry, Egypt with its strategic corridors, all now faced an altered landscape. If Burkina Faso could reject pressure and survive, what stopped them from doing the same? This was the essence of the moment. It was not simply about one policy clash. It was about rewriting assumptions. For generations, Africa's role in global trade was cast as reactive, dependent on external approval. Traoré's refusal hinted at a new script, proactive, self-assured, and rooted in collective strength. Yet the path was not guaranteed. Unity is fragile. Interests diverge. External actors, whether Western or otherwise, may seek to exploit those divisions. The question was whether Africa could seize this opening not only to resist, but to construct, to build institutions strong enough to make sovereignty sustainable. For the Burkinabe leader, youth remained both weapon and vulnerability. At 36, Traoré embodied a generational shift, unafraid, unencumbered by decades of foreign entanglement. But youth also drew criticism. Opponents branded him reckless, too eager to confront. Whether he could convert his fiery defiance into steady governance remained to be seen. Still, the symbolism endured. A seed had been planted, a seed of sovereignty that could grow if nurtured. The harvest, however, would depend on choices yet to be made. Would African leaders seize the momentum or let it wither under renewed pressure? Would multipolar partners prove reliable, or would they simply replace one dependency with another? The answers were not yet clear, but what was certain was this: Africa's road had forked. One path led back to submission, to cycles of dependency, to fear masquerading as policy. The other led forward, towards dignity, towards trade over aid, towards sovereignty spoken aloud. And so the cliffhanger remains. Is this merely a spark in Burkina Faso, or the dawn of a continental awakening? History often turns on moments that seem at first impossibly small: a signature withheld, a tariff refused, a single leader saying no where countless others had bowed. Yet such moments, like seeds cast into dry soil, can become forests if time and courage allow them to grow. Ibrahim Traoré's rejection of Trump's tariffs will be remembered not only for its defiance, but for what it revealed. It showed that Africa is no longer condemned to play the part of the obedient partner in global trade. It showed that even a landlocked nation of 22 million can defy the weight of Washington and remain standing. And it showed that sovereignty, long treated as rhetoric, can become reality when acted upon with conviction. For Burkina Faso, the journey is just beginning. Defiance must now be matched with development, rhetoric with results. The Ibrahim Traoré coup that first shook the nation in 2022 laid the foundation. His rejection of Trump's tariffs in 2025 built upon it. Whether the edifice will endure depends on choices made in the years ahead. But the symbolic power is already undeniable. Across Africa, leaders and citizens alike are asking, if Burkina Faso can, why not us? And beyond Africa, in Latin America and Asia, the same question quietly spreads. If fear is no longer inevitable, then compliance is no longer guaranteed. This is why the moment transcends economics. It is not simply about tariffs or trade. It is about dignity reclaimed, about sovereignty asserted. It is in truth a revolution of perception, the Burkina Faso revolution. And once perceptions shift, the world itself begins to tilt. The White House may yet threaten, sanction, or bluster, but the architecture of fear has cracked. And when fear collapses, the grip that once held nations in silence slips away. So we end with a question that belongs not to Washington or Ouagadougou alone, but to all who watch this moment unfold. If one young soldier can transform humiliation into defiance, if one small nation can ignite a continental spark, what stops the rest? If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not look away. Subscribe, comment, share, and walk with us into the story of Africa's rising dawn.